for their own emergency preparedness through allowing states that proactively funded hazard mitigation before the disaster to qualify for increased federal funding after a disaster. Considering how critical disaster preparedness and resiliency are for coastal communities across the nation, I hope to learn more about resiliency projects in Louisiana and how communities are taking advantage of opportunities available to them. FEMA also hosts a multitude of preparedness grants as well as hazard mitigation assistance grants to support first responders and protect people and property from future disasters in highly at-risk communities. These grants play an important role in helping police and fire departments improve public safety and strengthen communities' defenses against extreme weather events. Since state governments and local nonprofits are the first to respond, states should maintain and strengthen their state of preparedness to avoid becoming dependent on FEMA in the aftermath of a storm. However, we must also ensure that federal assistance is available to those who truly need it most. Should a catastrophic event occur in the future, effective federal, state, and local coordination is essential for our national preparedness and response. As such, the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006 was enacted specifically to address failures during Hurricane Katrina and to improve FEMA's role in our national emergency management and training. Earlier this year, this subcommittee heard from emergency management professionals and practitioners about some of the difficulties that survivors face in applying the individual assistance and for individual assistance. I look forward to hearing about how we can simplify and improve vulnerable communities' access to statewide resources, as well as FEMA's Individual Assistance Program and SBA's Disaster Loan Program in the aftermath of storms. I would like to know how we can make the process easier for disadvantaged or vulnerable communities so that they can get help they need. How can nonprofits, the private sector, and state and local governments better serve their communities so FEMA isn't left to pick up the tab? How are they using federal funds already available to them? I hope to hear your input to these questions. I know that coastal communities take care of one another, and while living by the coast can come at a cost, millions of Americans call these communities their home. It is our duty to serve them well and to ensure that they are prepared for whatever could come their way. Thank you again to the witnesses for being here this morning, for your public service, and for serving this great nation. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I want to welcome everyone to Louisiana's 2nd Congressional District, my home. Today, we gather here at Southern University, New Orleans, to discuss the topic so many New Orleanians are very, very familiar with, and that is emergency preparedness. I would like to thank Southern University staff and campus community for hosting today's event. I'd also like to thank our distinguished panel of witnesses here to share your expertise to the subcommittee. I want to thank the subcommittee chair, D'Esposito, for agreeing to hold this hearing in a bipartisan fashion. I want to thank Ranking Member Benny Thompson of the entire Committee of Homeland Security for being here. Thank you both for traveling from your homes so close after the holidays to be here with us for such an important hearing. Today's hearing is to learn more about the challenges and the successes of emergency preparedness in my district. I see in the audience we have a whole host of individuals, and I thank you for being here. I want to particularly recognize the council member whose district we're in, Council Member Eugene Green of District E. Thank you for being here, sir. New Orleans is at ground zero for so much of the conversation on emergency preparedness. Hurricane Katrina was one of the worst natural disasters in recent memory in the United States. Hurricane Katrina was followed by Hurricane Rita just a few weeks later. The hurricanes resulted in loss of life and property damage. In the aftermath of the hurricanes, the response efforts were scrutinized and many policies were changed for the better. There have been many other disasters to hit my district too, including Hurricanes Ike and Ida and the historic floodings of August of 2016. Because of these disasters, we have a better understanding of the importance of federal, state, local, and tribal territorial officials prioritizing emergency resources. Emergency preparedness to ensure that our communities are equipped to respond to disasters quickly and recover with dignity. The threat posed by climate change makes the conversation on preparedness even more important. The effects of climate change are being felt worldwide, which includes more frequent and severe natural disasters like hurricanes, droughts, and wildfires. At the federal level, investment in mitigation strategies have become a priority for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. I am pleased that the Biden-Harris administration has announced nearly $2 billion in grant funding to help communities mitigate the impacts of climate change. Flooding has increasingly become a concern in Louisiana, contributing to the increasing costs of flood insurance policies. Louisianians rely on the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, to offer reasonably priced coverage. However, FEMA's new Risk Rating 2.0 system guts that program and causes great challenges. We'll hear more about that today. Risk Rating 2.0 will result in a 134% average increase in flood insurance costs for single-family homes in Louisiana, phased in over time. This policy will leave many Louisianians vulnerable to extreme weather events because they simply cannot afford to pay these exorbitant costs for flood insurance. Another concern facing my constituents is small business administration loans. Many of my constituents own businesses, and when disasters strike, they have to take out a loan to make the repairs and stay afloat. Unfortunately, some of the small businesses are still paying loans from years and disasters past, while we continue to face additional storms and natural disasters and having to face the struggles of depending on yet another SBA loan. I hope to hear from our witnesses today about how we are working to make sure that flood insurance does not become a luxury that only a few can afford, in ways that we can help small businesses literally stay afloat. Since the terrorist acts of 9/11, emergency preparedness has also included providing federal resources for combating threats and acts of violence. The Department of Homeland Security's Preparedness Grant Program, which includes urban area security initiatives, state homeland security programs, and the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which helps communities prepare for and address threats. In 2022, Southern University campus in Baton Rouge is one of the many historically black colleges and universities across the country that was targeted with a bomb threat. Making sure that the DHS preparedness grants reach HBCUs and other targeted places is essential. I am proud to advocate for DHS's preparedness grants and hope to hear from our witnesses today on how these programs are helping Louisianians. Lastly, I would like to emphasize, as we continue to face more frequent and severe emergencies, it is becoming increasingly clear that our emergency management systems need to prioritize equity. Vulnerable populations are often hit the hardest by disasters and oftentimes receive disproportionate amount of resources. Building equity into emergency management means ensuring that all individuals and communities have equal access to resources and support before, during, and after the disaster. This not only helps to prevent further harm, but it also strengthens overall resiliency. In May, I joined Ranking Member Thompson as a co-chair of the first ever Congressional Disaster Equity and Building Resilience Caucus. The caucus aims to promote equity and disaster preparedness and response and provide valuable forums to discuss federal policies that impact the underserved communities in the face of disasters. Again, I want to thank Southern University, SUNO, for hosting our witnesses and participating in today's hearing, and my colleagues for making time to be here in my district. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on how we can continue to build and support emergency preparedness for all of Louisianians. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I now recognize the Ranking Member of the full committee for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I want to thank Ranking Member Troy Carter for bringing the subcommittee to this congressional district to look at issues regarding emergency preparedness and how the federal government can better support the needs of coastal communities. Ranking Member Carter is a tireless advocate in Washington, D.C. for the people of the 2nd District of Louisiana, and I'm glad to participate in this important hearing. And I also say it's easy to come to New Orleans when you're invited, so I'm glad to be back. I want to thank Chairman D'Esposito for agreeing to hold today's hearing. I know he represents a coastal district on Long Island, New York, and I look forward to a productive discussion on issues of shared interest. I'd also like to express my appreciation to all the witnesses present here today. Finally, I'm pleased to be at Southern University in New Orleans, a prominent historically black university. I'd like to thank the university for hosting this hearing and its staff for their hospitality. As a double HBCU graduate, I'm always happy to come to an HBCU campus. With that said, I want to turn to the topic of today's hearing. Over the years, we've seen more frequent and powerful storms, which have caused billions of dollars in damage. In my home state of Mississippi, each year since 1980, we have averaged about 2.3 disasters crossing the billion-dollar mark. In 2005, both Mississippi and Louisiana were hit by one of the worst natural disasters, Hurricane Katrina, which was then followed by Hurricane Rita. The devastation and the lack of proper emergency response by local, state, and federal officials during these disasters will forever be imprinted in my mind. Thankfully, emergency management has significantly improved since Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, due in no small part to actions taken based on lessons learned from those storms. More recently, tornadoes devastated my home district, tragically killing 22 people. FEMA has been present and ready to help at every step since the tornado, and we are thankful for their assistance. Disasters often hit vulnerable populations the hardest, including low-income communities, rural areas, racial minorities, tribes, individuals with disabilities, seniors, and children. Those with experience in disaster response are well aware of the unequal treatment marginalized communities have received during Hurricane Katrina. I hope to never see people trapped, hungry, and fearing for their lives in the aftermath of a disaster because local, state, and federal officials prioritize one group over another. Fortunately, the Biden administration is doing more to support communities like those in Louisiana and Mississippi, which frequently faced unequal impacts of disasters. For example, it has included equity as one of the main pillars of FEMA's 2022 to 2026 strategic plan. The Biden administration has also made long-needed policy changes that increase the accessibility of FEMA's programs, such as expanding allowable ownership documentation to help disaster survivors keep land that has been in the family for generations. As we face more frequent and severe emergency, it is critical that we prioritize equity. The lack of equitable resources during a disaster is appalling, which is why I, along with Representatives Carter, Titus, and Brian Higgins, created the Congressional Disaster Equity and Building Resilience Caucus. The caucus provides a valuable forum to discuss federal policies that impact underserved communities in disasters. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses today on how we can continue to support emergency preparedness for the people of Louisiana. With that, I thank Ranking Member Carter for having us in his district today. I also thank Chairman D'Esposito for holding the hearing and the witnesses for joining us. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Thompson. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I am very pleased, as we all mentioned, to have such an important panel of witnesses this morning. I ask that the witnesses please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Tony Robinson serves as the Regional Administrator for FEMA's Region 6, which oversees FEMA's efforts in Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and 68 federally recognized tribal nations within this geographic area. In this role, Mr. Robinson has managed over $1 billion in grant funding each fiscal year to assist Region 6 partners in preparing for and recovering from disasters. Mr. Francisco Sanchez Jr. serves as the Associate Administrator for the U.S. Small Business Administration's Office of Disaster Recovery and Resilience. An Associate Administrator, Mr. Sanchez is responsible for supporting America's 33 million small businesses, renters, and homeowners to help them withstand or recover from natural disasters. Mr. Casey Tingle has served as the Director of the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness for the state of Louisiana since 2021. In this capacity, Director Tingle directs all aspects of the state's homeland security, emergency, and disaster preparedness and response, including billions of dollars in mitigation projects to protect Louisiana communities. Mrs. Pamela Granger is a licensed civil engineer in Louisiana and Florida and has been a civil engineer for over 27 years. She is the president and owner of McBade Engineers and Consultants and brings a wealth of experience in managing large civil works projects for local, state, and federal clients throughout the Gulf Coast. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and again, thank you for your service to our coastal communities in this region. I now recognize Region 6 Administrator Robinson for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman D'Esposito, Ranking Member Carter, and Congressman Thompson. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today to discuss the mission of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I'm Tony Robinson, Regional Administrator for FEMA Region 6. I've been with FEMA since 1987, and I'm responsible for covering Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and the 68 federally recognized tribal nations within this geographic area. FEMA has a powerful mission, helping people before, during, and after disasters. In recent years, carrying out that mission has become more challenging and complex as we now face intensified natural disasters throughout the year, often in communities not used to experiencing them. In the face of this new reality, it is more important than ever that we break the cycle of disaster damage and reconstruction. We must focus on being better prepared, resilient, and vigilant against these ever-increasing threats. Under Administrator Crispo's leadership, with bipartisan support in Congress, and in close collaboration with federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, community-based organizations, and the private sector, FEMA is leading the way towards greater resilience. FEMA is not only a response and recovery agency, we also work to mitigate the worst impacts of disasters before they occur. Hazard mitigation saves lives, results in less complex disaster recoveries, and can help us break the disaster cycle. That is why we appreciate Congress's support in authorizing and funding the Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund as another mechanism for FEMA to increase the resiliency of our nation by providing new types of financial support to our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. On September 12, 2023, FEMA awarded the first round of storm funding to Louisiana to kickstart a loan program to help communities reduce their vulnerability to natural hazards and disasters. FEMA awarded Louisiana $6.9 million, the highest among the 8 selected recipients. FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program has also proven to be a very effective tool for mitigation efforts. To date, FEMA has allocated nearly $4 billion in grant funding to states, local communities, tribal nations, and territories to undertake hazard mitigation projects. BRIC is being made more accessible to communities that are most at risk and most in need through the implementation of the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act of 2022. FEMA announced the first set of zones in September that designate high-risk, disadvantaged communities, allowing them to receive up to 90% federal cost share for projects primarily benefiting those zones. Here in Louisiana, Jefferson Parish was selected for a project to harden power infrastructure to protect residents, essential businesses, and emergency services providers from hurricane-force winds, as well as upgrade poles and wire to withstand 150-mile-per-hour winds and lightning strikes. When completed, this project is expected to save lives by keeping the power on to communities even during severe weather events. In Plaquemines Parish, where the historic community of Ironton experienced devastating flooding levels as high as 12 to 14 feet during Hurricane Ida, our direct technical assistance program is working with communities to develop an application that will identify solutions to improve the community's drainage system during future events. As the committee knows, disaster recovery is often complex, painstaking, and takes a long time. Preparing our communities to recover quicker when disasters happen is part of building a resilient nation. FEMA, in partnership with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, established a first-of-its-kind pre-disaster state housing planning initiative designed to assist participating states in developing or maturing their pre-disaster housing strategy. I would like to commend Louisiana for being one of the first 4 states to join this new initiative. Under Administrator Criswell's leadership, we have taken concrete steps to simplify and create more equitable solutions through the Individual Assistance Program. In 2021, we expanded methods of ownership verification for homeowners whose properties had been handed down informally through generations, as well as expanding methods of occupancy verification for owners and renters. As a result, in 2022, an additional $348 million of assistance went to more than 78,000 renters, and an additional $444 million went to more than 57,000 homeowners. FEMA is also in the process of making it easier for survivors to apply for disaster assistance with the online application available on disasterassistance.gov. Instead of requiring survivors to answer questions for every possible program, we're shifting to a tailored, needs-based assessment process. The new process will improve the customer experience and reduce the burden for applicants by providing a more intuitive application process. There is still much more to do to build a more resilient America, but FEMA is well positioned to address the increasing range and complexities of disasters, support the diversity of communities we serve, and meet our nation's growing expectations of the agency. We appreciate and continue to need Congress's support as we execute our mission of helping people before, during, and after disasters. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. I now recognize Associate Administrator Sanchez for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Desposito, Ranking Members Carter and Thompson. I'm Francisco Sanchez, the Associate Administrator of the Office of Disaster Recovery and Resilience at SBA. On behalf of Administrator Isabel Casillas-Guzman and the entire agency, thank you for your support of our disaster mission and also for convening this discussion on federal, state, and local coordination in coastal communities. Being in a local role before joining SBA, it's precisely the type of work that I've been engaged in for about the past 2 decades. In my career in emergency management, started unexpectedly with a storm on the Texas-Louisiana coast, has been defined by storms on the Texas-Louisiana coast, and will likely end with a storm on the Texas-Louisiana coast. My first 2 official visits in this role were to Florida and to here in Louisiana. And I know from personal experience that the representatives on this panel are collaborators at all levels of government, and they represent the kind of coordination and trusted coordination that comes from both the opportunity and, quite frankly, the challenge of having to work together so frequently. The disaster enterprise at SBA fulfills one of the agency's most important functions. Its mission is to provide affordable, timely, and accessible financial assistance to businesses of all sizes, private nonprofits, homeowners, and renters. The SBA offers low-interest, long-term federal loans for disaster losses not covered by insurance. Our world-class team works tirelessly to enhance our programs and resources, ensuring that the nation's 33 million small businesses, along with countless homeowners, renters, and nonprofits, can access recovery and mitigation resources they need to rebuild in a way that's stronger, smarter, and more resilient. 2022 set a record. The U.S. experienced 18 separate weather and climate disasters, each costing more than $1 billion. And fast forward to this year, we are unfortunately breaking even more records. In 2023, as of early November, there have been 25 confirmed disaster events with losses each exceeding $1 billion in the United States. At the end of 2023 fiscal year, SBA was involved in 405 disaster declarations across this country, and this morning, SBA is on the ground in 31 disasters across 24 states, 2 territories, and nearly 170 counties or parishes across this country. Under the Biden-Harris administration, SBA has approved more than 105,000 loans, resulting in an excess of $5.9 billion in low-interest loan disaster lending in the hands of disaster survivors to help them to rebuild and recover. And to be clear, this year has involved a wildfire on a tropical island in the Pacific and a hurricane making landfall across the California desert. We're in New Orleans today, but the tropical storms are not the only threat to coastal communities as the climate changes. This year, Louisiana faced multiple disasters related to wildfire. The most substantial of these fires, the Tiger Island fire in Beauregard Parish, stands as perhaps one of the largest wildfires recorded in the state's history. And simultaneously, the threat of tropical cyclones not only persists, but is also growing. In 2020, Louisiana experienced 5 direct tropical cyclone landfalls, setting the record for the highest number for any single state in a hurricane season. Under Administrator Guzman's leadership, the SBA announced major changes to its disaster lending program. For the first time in 30 years, SBA increased loan limits for homeowners' primary residence from $200,000 to $500,000, and we increased limits for personal property such as clothing, furniture, appliances, and automobiles from $40,000 to $100,000. And to give homeowners and businesses time to recover from a disaster, SBA's initial deferment period went from 5 months to 12 months and deferred interest for those 12 months as well. To improve customer experience, SBA launched the My SBA Loan Portal in February of 2023, allowing users to use a single login across multiple programs across SBA for managing their loans, programs like our Small Business Vet Certification, or our Vet Cert program, and now a new online disaster assistance application that will ease the burden on disaster survivors and expedite how quickly we can get money into their hands. This effort aligns with an important commitment of Administrator Guzman and Executive Order 14058 that directs us to design and deliver a streamlined online disaster assistance application experience. These steps are important, but preparedness starts before disasters. And so as I close, I will highlight that SBA has extended its assistance for its mitigation programs to help them prepare for disasters to come. This year, SBA changed the final rule. Before, you could only use mitigation lending for the disaster type you just faced. Now you can mitigate against any type of hazard that you're facing in your community. And that common sense solution will help us be more resilient moving ahead. So, Chairman, thank you so much for the opportunity and members the invitation to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Sanchez. I now recognize Director Tingle for his opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman D'Esposito, Ranking Member Carter, Ranking Member Thompson, for inviting me here today and for holding this important hearing. To the staff and to SUNO for hosting us, thank you for your work as well. I'm Casey Tingle, the Director of the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness for the state of Louisiana, the state agency that's got lead responsibility for the coordination of emergency management in the state. The relationship between federal, state, local emergency management partners is critical. While each maintains separate authorities and capabilities, we must connect and support one another to effectively and timely save lives and property. In Louisiana, just in Governor Edwards' 8-year term, Louisiana has been impacted by roughly 250 local events that involve some level of state coordination or support. Only 50 of these were raised to the level of a state emergency declaration, and over 20 of those were federal declaration. The point there is simply that while large events are increasing and the demand on the federal system is increasing, the number of small events is also increasing. And so the demands that we see at the state and local level correspond to what we have heard from our federal partners. And every day, somewhere, local partners are responding to some sort of an emergency event, and often in Louisiana, that is the case. And a number of these events remain local events. We've seen since Hurricane Katrina in 2005 much progress in our response posture. I'm happy to report that, and our response to a number of events we've already heard from 2020, 2021, 2016, hurricanes, floods, bears that out. This coordination with our key federal partners and local partners is continuous. I think that's important to note, and it benefits from not just work in exercise scenarios, but in all of the real world work that we have done responding to numerous events. I want to highlight on behalf of the states of Louisiana's investment in emergency management. In the most recent legislative session, we were appropriated state funds so that we could pass through an increase of $3 million every year in emergency performance management performance grant funding to our parish partners, recognizing a significant increase to them to build their local capacity. Whether it's cyber response, whether it's building a new shelter or warehouse capacity, or managing the first of its kind state temporary housing program after Ida, the state of Louisiana continues to increase its investment and role in emergency management for our state. I want to highlight the importance of the EMPG funding and what it has meant for the state of Louisiana and the work that it does and the value that it provides every day for events that never rise to the level of a federal declaration. This funding is some of the most flexible funding that we have in this space, and as a one-for-one match, it brings a great return on investment. There's broad consensus in the emergency management community for the need to increase this funding, and I would encourage all of you to consider that as you make determinations on budgets to come. Secondarily, Senate Bill 3071, the Disaster Management Cost Modernization Act, could also provide additional funding to state and local partners without the appropriation of any new dollars, simply allowing the flexibility to allocate dollars that are already funded under the disaster, allowing those funds to go farther and do more than they are currently allowed to do. House support for this approach would be another tangible step towards supporting better preparedness at the state and local level. On behalf of the state of Louisiana, just a couple of points that I would make in terms of our support for our locals. We process in the neighborhood of $1 to $1.5 billion in reimbursements every year related to disaster management programs. So we've got a great deal of support to this. Some of the things that we have done recently is to procure at the state level program management contracts that allow our locals to better access these programs and utilize these programs without some of the administrative red tape. We provide funding and technical assistance so that all parishes can have a hazard mitigation plan to access hazard mitigation funding. And then finally, we've got staff that are dedicated to the work to reduce complexity of managing these programs and a great deal of experience doing so. The Disaster Survivors Fairness Act and Disaster Assistance Simplification Act are both examples of your work in this space, and I want to thank you for that and thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Mr. Tingle. And now recognize Mrs. Granger for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Esposito, Ranking Member Carter, Ranking Member Thompson, and other members of the subcommittee. I am Pamela Gonzalez Granger. I'm a practicing civil engineer in the state of Louisiana. I've been practicing for 29 years. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree. All of my clients are government clients. So I have chosen to spend the last 29 years helping our local, state, and federal partners with recovery, with infrastructure projects, and rather than doing any private development. I'm honored here to testify before you based upon my experience for the past 7 years since the August 2016 flood that we commonly call DR 4277. That is when in Youngsville, where I live and where my firm is and where I currently practice, we received more than 32 inches of rain in less than 48 hours. So while it wasn't a hurricane and we're about 40 miles from the coast, we are tidally influenced. And so what happens in Youngsville, adjacent communities, communities downstream, communities upstream, we're all in it together, we're all affected. The hazard mitigation program is one of what I feel one of the best programs in order to work with mitigation of projects from disasters, such as the disaster 4277. Oftentimes, many small communities do not have the funds in order to do the projects that are really needed in order to reduce the base flood elevation. If we want to get flood insurance down, we need to focus on doing projects that reduce the base flood elevation. The two projects that we have experience in doing under this program not only benefited the city of Youngsville, but local cities around, parishes downstream and upstream. So programs like these need to be continued because local charters don't always allow you to spend money on projects that would help other communities. And your local charters usually want to keep your money within your community. But with that said, most small communities don't have the resources and don't have the experience with navigating the hazard mitigation program and many of the federal programs. Some might call it red tape. I refer to it as duct tape in a ball, that you're trying to open up and spread and make one straight line. And with that, there were many challenges, and that's what my testimony, my written testimony that I provided was based upon the challenges. While there are benefits and the projects are now complete, there are benefits of 4 to 12 inches of base flood reduction for many, many people within the community. But there were challenges with the procurement policy. There are challenges once the project is started with the goalpost moving as far as for what your requirements are. So you may start, and if there are modifications, you will submit plans and you could be required to make modifications on some new procedure or process unbeknownst to you, delaying and causing increase in cost. When you apply for a project, you have to put all your funds at the beginning, and so those could change over time. There's also the challenge of the coordination and the review timing and the coordination of when to get the comments back. We always have a deadline on us as to when we have to provide comments, and we have to provide quarterly reports, but there don't appear to be deadlines on the opposite end. There is a central portal which oftentimes doesn't work or has the inability to be used for certain times. And then if you successfully get it through like we did on the projects, there comes the last challenge of reimbursements. While I recognize there are a lot of programs, we are only 2 projects of 132 that went through the application process of DR 4277. We are the only 2 that went to construction, and here we are 7 years after that disaster. But with those reimbursements taking long, consultants like myself and the contractors are now footing the bill because we're the ones that are waiting to be paid 90 to 120 days. I am a small business, so are these contractors. So we have a lot with technology and the ability that we have before us. We have a lot of work to do. The program is really great. I look forward to working with anyone who would like to ask questions or work with me on some of the challenges and ideas because we lived it. And so I thank you for the opportunity today and look forward to answering any questions and helping you guys in the future.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Granger. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. And as someone who has spent his adult life in the emergency management world, I think one of the questions that we always ask ourselves is, are we better off today than we were the last time we were faced with an emergency similar? And through all of your opening statements, I heard a common theme: coordination, being better prepared, having communication amongst all agencies. So, Mr. Tingle, I know we discussed much of this yesterday when we did our tour, but like many coastal states, I think New York, there are many coastal states that we have flood-prone communities, but there are different challenges throughout different locations in the state. And in New York, Long Island, and my colleagues, Mr. Garbarino, Mr. Lalota, we face very different concerns on Long Island as they may in Buffalo and Syracuse in Westchester. So as someone who represents the entire state, how do you focus not only during emergencies, but preparing for the next emergency to make sure that every area of the state of Louisiana has the proper resources that they need, and that no one is neglected.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. So on behalf of the state of Louisiana, we've got emergency management offices by law in each of our 64 parishes. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we have continued to pass along more of our EMPG funding to each of them. The best response is always the local response. And so the better positioned our local partners are, the better positioned we as a state and we as a nation will be. So we take that effort very seriously. So we work very closely with our locals. We view it as our job to support them, to help fill gaps for them, and to ensure that they are providing to us the information and the resource requests that they need so that we can benefit them timely. So I think it's that partnership that makes a difference on behalf of the state of Louisiana.
Thank you. And I think one of the issues that we've been focused on in this committee, because I think it's important, I always compare it to New York. I think about the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy and preparing and making sure that resources were allocated correctly throughout the state. And there is no question that during emergencies, resources are allocated. I think that it's always in the best interest, but sometimes those resources are not allocated to the places that they really should be. And one of the things that we've been focused on is making sure, and one of the reasons for this hearing, is that we are coordinated with all agencies, federal, state, and local. And places like Louisiana, and I'll compare it to home on Long Island. I mean, on Long Island, our fire service is comprised of mostly volunteers. From the city line all the way out to Montauk, the entire Long Island is pretty much volunteer fire service. And now you take a large-scale emergency and you coordinate the local police departments, the emergency management system, the volunteer fire service, FEMA, the Small Business Administration. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. What can we do better? And I know that we have tried to push out the information to these smaller organizations and institutions to make sure that they have the ability to apply for the grant funding and they know the resources that are available. But what can we do better to make sure that it's not just the big organizations that are getting that large pot of money, that we can actually get into the communities, the smaller communities, the ones that actually really need the money and the resources to battle these emergencies? What can we all do better as members of Congress, and what can we do better as the federal government to make sure that they have, and really this question is to all of you. So if we want to start with Mr. Robinson and work our way down, what can we do better to make sure that even the smallest communities are getting the information that they need to be provided the resources to really help them survive?
Thank you, Chairman. And I think your point on coordination and collaboration is key. We have to build relationships before the event and emergency management. And so for Region 6, we work very closely with all of our partners at the federal and state level. And I think the important thing that we really focused on in the last several years is who are the influencers in communities. So those faith-based organizations, the organizations that really have that grassroots connection that can get that information out to individuals. So those are some of the things that we're working on through our office in coordination with our states.
Great. Mr. Sanchez?
Great. Thank you, Chairman, for the question. I think the coordination piece is critical. I think there's three ways we look at it from our function: is coordinate, collaborate, and communicate. How do we coordinate with state, local, and federal partners? How do we communicate all that information? And how do we collaborate on the solutions that make sense for a community? We're unique in seeing the sort of, we're opening access to governors so they can make more disaster declarations, but we're leading from the ground up with local communities, making sure that when we go on the ground, we're learning from those local chambers, those local organizations, making sure that we're going what they are. And so all the data-driven decisions we make also go into local communities for context to ensure that we're where we need to be, making sure that our programs get to those communities that need it, but that everyone is aware of that as well.
Right. Mr. Tingle?
I would add to that, certainly I would agree with those comments. I would add that in your role in particular, there is a balance between appropriate oversight and ensuring that taxpayer dollars are spent appropriately, and all of us, certainly support that. But how you do that through policy, how you do that through legislation, oftentimes ends up meaning that we spend more money trying to manage the dollar than we're actually implementing. And so to Ms. Granger's point earlier in her comments, I would just say that as we create legislation, as we review policies in the Stafford Act and other places, the ability to reduce complexity. There is only so much technical assistance that we can provide to communities. If the barrier to those programs and the level of sophistication that you have to have and experience to navigate them is in many cases a turnoff to communities. They're afraid of accessing, they're afraid of getting something wrong, they're afraid of the clawback on the backside of doing something. And so I would just advocate strongly for balancing that oversight component with is the complexity that we are including to get that oversight also costing us money, and the opportunity cost that communities are not accessing those programs because they're afraid of that complexity.
Thank you, Mr. Tingle. And Ms. Granger, I'm over my time, but if you could be brief to that question and I guess specifically how small business is affected and how we can do better for that.
Well, I think to get to the community, like you said, right now the money goes to the state to parishes from our perspective. All this competition from the state divvying up on the HMGP, if it actually went to the communities directly, if there was a way you could, no different than how some COVID money was able to be worked with projects directly with the communities. There's just lots of levels. If there was a way that it doesn't have to always go through 3 to 4 levels, that would be one. And from a small business, just like anything else, there are some federal programs where it's mandated small businesses have to be paid within a certain amount of time. I mean, putting that onus on whoever it is that's doing it. We have time limits. Contractors have time limits with liquidated damages. I'm just saying, putting it on folks to have time limits on what they do as well.
Thank you. And with the red dot, I've clearly violated my time limit. But I now recognize my good friend, and thank you again for having us and welcoming us, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Carter.
Thank you. I mentioned earlier the National Flood Insurance Program, Risk Rating 2.0, has caused hardships for many property owners in New Orleans and throughout Louisiana. FEMA professes that Risk Rating 2.0 is a better solution to managing flood risk. But when I talk to those who are impacted with the higher and rising flood insurance programs, I hear something totally different. When Secretary Mayorkas was before our committee, I challenged him on the reality of what Risk Rating 2.0 is doing to many underserved communities and many communities, period, throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and many other states. He then recognized and acknowledged publicly that it is a work in progress and we have to continue to work on ways to make it better and more equitable. Mr. Tingle, can you discuss the impacts of Risk Rating 2.0 on Louisianians?
I will do my best, sir. You certainly laid out some important information there, which I would agree with. There are two, amongst the whole realm of Risk Rating 2.0 and some of the challenges, there are two things that I would point out to the committee for consideration. One is under the legacy system of NFIP, there was a great deal of transparency in terms of if I elevate my house a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, I can estimate with some deal of clarity what the reduction in my policy premium is going to be. There was not a strict calculation, but a general sense of every foot that you elevated a house, what your savings was going to be. That no longer exists under Risk Rating 2.0. So that lack of transparency with what can I do to my house to lower my premium, I think there are some things in progress, but that clearly was not the case with the initial rollout, and clearly more work needs to be done there. And then the second critical point that I would highlight is just the need for an affordability program to be able to offset some of those costs. From my perspective, rolling out the premium change without a corresponding affordability program is devastating to so many coastal communities in the state of Louisiana and other states as well.
Thank you. It's literally causing people to have to make the determination, can they afford to live in the home that in many cases they've paid for, and now find themselves with not a house note, but a flood insurance note that oftentimes is more expensive than the House note itself. Mr. Robinson, thank you, Regional Administrator Robinson, for listening and being a part of the discussion. Has FEMA considered exploring a means-based assistance program as recommended by the GAO report entitled Flood Insurance, FEMA's new rate-setting methodology improves soundness but highlights need for a broader program? This study really spelled out a lot of the issues that are there. Can you share with us your thoughts on what you guys are doing to recognize some of these?
Thank you, Congressman Carter. And as you all know, insurance obviously is a great way for individuals to recover much more quickly in a disaster. And so Risk Rating 2.0 established the flood insurance premium on each individual home's unique flood risk. And so we know increasing premiums are a challenge. The agency has submitted an affordability framework to Congress that I believe does take into consideration some of the GAO considerations. For my commitment to you as Region 6 Regional Administrator and the things that I can control, we're going to continue to work very closely with the state to look at mitigation measures that we can put into effect that lower the risk to homeowners that would bring those insurance premiums down. The other thing that we are very aggressive on is getting communities to participate in the community rating system. And that can enable 5 to 45% reduction in insurance rates depending on a community's community rating system rating.
Thank you. It's an ongoing issue. We'll continue to bring it back. This is not the first time you've heard me say this. It comes up in every committee that we have. And with my remaining time, which I'm running close to, Associate Administrator Sanchez, in my opening remarks, I talked about the increased burden that small businesses have. Every time there's a storm, many small business owners have to make loans. Every time there's a natural disaster to get their businesses back up. We know the benefit of small businesses. They're the backbone of our community. They hire people. They pay sales taxes. Sales taxes pay for police and fire and other resources. Yet they continue to be strangled with loan after loan after loan. I have spoken with the administrator repeatedly, and I'll ask you the same question. Where do we stand on working on loan forgiveness? We forgive small countries. We forgive financial institutions and automobile institutions. What about a forgiveness program for small businesses that will allow them to continue to provide jobs and resources?
Thanks for that question. It is a concern that we hear repeatedly. And we can't by law forgive loans, but we do everything we can within our authorities to address those challenges. And thank you for the opportunity to invite our staff on a regular basis to help prepare businesses here in advance of hurricanes.
You guys have done a great job with that, by the way. So I want to thank you and your local team, as with everyone at the table. All of you have been great. The questions that we pose to you are not to pick on you, but questions that we continue to wrestle with.
Yeah, so within our authorities, here's one of the things we can't forgive loans, but we're looking for ways to reduce that impact and be more customer friendly. One of those is extending the deferment period for an initial loan for 12 months in zero interest. And we're also, we've talked about mitigation. SBA is often the first and only federal agency on the ground. We talked about in Louisiana, for example, 36 disasters in the past 10 years. 17 of those has been SBA agency declarations, and we're the only agency on the ground for those and those smaller disasters. And they add up when businesses are impacted over and over. On the mitigation front, as we're pushing that program so that hopefully businesses in coastal communities or that are impacted again and again don't have to even come back to us again. For right now, we've prioritized our mitigation lending program. And so in fiscal year 22, there were only about $9 million in mitigation lending. We've prioritized education so that businesses know that they have the opportunity to mitigate when they're facing a disaster. We've increased that from about $9 million to $66 million. It's almost 3 times what we did the previous year in loan amounts. And so within our constraints, working to prioritize mitigation so they don't have to come for us for additional.
So real quickly, I'm over my time, and the chairman's been very, very generous, but I'm going to end it real quickly. You indicated it's not. What's the impediment? And tell me if the impediment is Congress. We're more than ready to remove that impediment, and we'd like to know we'll have your support in doing so.
So it is something that we hear consistent frustration from, and I know businesses and homeowners that are repeatedly having to come to SBA loans would be appreciative of.
Good enough. We'll have a bill before ends week. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. And now I recognize Ranking Member of the entire committee, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Granger, I feel your pain. I have 2 working disasters going in my district, and one of the things I have historically promoted is for people in the local area to get employed, either through the local hire program at FEMA or as a subcontractor or contractor in their respective community. Now, we have some challenges. One is a majority of my emergency managers in my counties are part-time. That means that, you know, they're the veteran service officer or they're the farmer or something like that. So some of the training and certifications that are required kind of hit and miss. But what happens with an engineering firm is the big boys show up and just gobble up everything. And so a company like yours is just kind of pushed to the side. I'm looking for what safeguards can we put in place so that local businesses who have capacity won't be pushed to the side. Can you help me with that?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Well, just like the federal government has the 8A set-aside program where you can give federal contracts to somebody that's 8A, why couldn't the government say, if it's a small business in that community and it's that community's trusted advisor, why can't they use those communities? And that's what I meant by the procurement policy. Because right now, the procurement policy says, if I help my community write the application, because I know everything about it and I work as their extension of staff, I can't then do the work. And that big firm comes in, and the big firms know that. So they wait for the little firms who are working with the communities to help them in the recovery, identify the project, write the grant, and then they come in when you have to go through federal procurement policy if you get the federal loan, and that's how they come in. So modifications to that federal procurement policy, because if the federal government can say if you're an 8A, you can get direct, which I totally agree with, the whole idea is the level playing field. I don't think the federal procurement policy with the level playing field was trying to keep small businesses out. I think they were trying to help small business. The problem is the way it's written and the way it goes. That would be one thing, I think, because I think a lot of times, a lot of these small communities are saying, I don't want to work with them, so they're going to not put the application in, and I'm not going to put the application in for a large firm to come in, because the other thing that happens, Mr. Thompson, is that the small community will have to pay me so that I can explain to the large firm what to do.
Yeah. Let me give you another issue for Mr. Tingle. And I'll get to Mr. Robinson on the second round. FEMA approves the reimbursement, and it comes to the state. And it takes longer for the state to approve the reimbursement that FEMA has already approved. So you have Ms. Granger and other subs out there, you know, they've done everything they need. And what is it you think we could do to streamline just the reimbursement if it goes straight to FEMA and FEMA say, okay, since we're putting the money in, we approve it? Help us out.
Sure. So a bit of context from my experience is the one piece of that puzzle that I think would be most helpful here is if the FEMA approval included language that they are approving that the costs that they've reviewed are reasonable, and that the execution of those costs is in line with their rules. The way it stands now, the FEMA approval doesn't cover all of the things that have to be provided at audit, and it leaves the state at some risk that if anything about that process is incomplete, FEMA is going to ask for the money back. And the state is the first in line to have to deal with that clawback. And so right now, there is a bit of risk that some of the things that FEMA does and some of the flexibility that they offer helps them, but it doesn't necessarily resolve risk at the state or local level.
So is there a time limit that the state is required to complete that review?
So there is a time limit between the state and locals. There, in terms of what we respond to FEMA with, I would just clarify that I think that the answer to that question is more that what is not time-based in terms of FEMA policy is the time for which they have to act.
Okay. On the second round, Mr. Robinson, you can get ready for that.
Want to do while you're at it?
Oh, well, okay. Well, Mr. Robinson, how do you help us streamline reimbursement after a disaster for contractors like Ms. Granger?
So obviously one of the most important things that we do is the reimbursement process. And so a couple of things, and I'll just highlight a couple of things that Casey talked about. I think one of the things that we see is as audits come out, especially long, high dollar amounts, that really puts a risk base on the state, who is our primary recipient. And so when there's an issue, that's who we ask for money back for. And so where we see big audits, I think that really slows down the process, because there's a lot of fear in the system about, have I done everything correctly? So in Region 6, some of the things that we're doing is we're really focusing on a pre-disaster procurement training. And so we get out, work with our states, work with the locals on the things that they need to be looking out for. So the small business set aside clauses in contracts, because the last thing we want them to do is go through a contract. And what we see in audits is about 60% of them are either based on audits or procurement or documentation. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing that and training up front, so that those aren't issues that they deal with on the back end of disaster and slows down reimbursement.
Does that make sense, Ms. Granger?
Well, maybe to them. I think what he's trying to say is that I think a lot of people are so risk averse that they're just taking their time and they're looking for everything. But if there's an issue, or if there's something that you're risk averse about and you have a question, they do not pick up the phone, or they contact the local. If there's a question with something on procurement, if there's a question with something on an invoice or whatever, they're not readily picking up the phone saying, I got it in front of me, I got these questions. That is not what happens. What happens is when you wait, you're calling and saying what seems to be the issue, and nobody can give you that answer.
So we need to look somehow at, if there's an issue with the reimbursement, the person who finds the issue needs to contact the company right then. Makes sense.
Yes, sir.
So is that, now that's the state.
Yes, sir. So we've got primary responsibility there. I would say that one thing that I think should be considered here is that we've made a lot of progress under public assistance grants with finding ways to improve the cash flow. So when the administration raised the cap of the small project threshold, for example, to $1 million, that greatly relieved the administrative burden on state and locals to expedite cash flow. That only applies to public assistance. If we could do something like that under the hazard mitigation program, regardless of where the threshold is, that just simply said that once approved, that grant can be paid out to the subgrantee, I think that would be a great step forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. So, Mr. Tingle, in your previous role as Assistant Deputy Director for Hazard Mitigation Assistance for the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness for the state of Louisiana, you oversaw the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance, and Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program that collectively represented $2.5 billion in projects to protect people and property from natural disasters. I think something that we've seen in many states, and I think it's one of the questions or the comments that I posed in the beginning, was that as emergency managers, we always try to be better off today than we were at the last emergency. So we've seen during storms, we've seen even during the COVID-19 pandemic, that proactive, or I should say at that point, they're reactive governments often make changes. I mean, you look at COVID, and there are many municipalities that made building and zoning changes so that restaurants and small businesses could stay afloat and keep their doors open. So through that $2.5 billion that has been allocated, have you seen in Louisiana that it's been used the right way, and are people and are the local municipalities changing and making changes to their, let's say, their building codes, their floodplain management? Are they making the necessary changes so that this money is actually being utilized correctly to prepare us for the future?
Yes, sir. So unlike some of the former question, that one's easy. The answer is yes. So in support of our local partners, I think as we saw some elevations as we drove around yesterday, we saw houses that 3-4 feet above the ground today, so that in a future rainfall event, while the street may flood, while the yard may have water, the home is going to be safe. And so that's true across coastal Louisiana, across many parts of Louisiana. The level of engagement at the local level to pursue these mitigation programs, to execute these mitigation programs, as Ms. Granger has outlined, the patience and the persistence that it takes, that's true across Louisiana. I'm proud of those local partners and all the work they do in interfacing both with homeowners and property owners, as well as doing community-based projects. So in terms of where we've progressed to, that's one of the changes. The projects Ms. Granger mentioned are not individual home elevations. They are detention projects that are finding a way to hold rainfall so that it doesn't immediately go in the street or immediately flood. We've got projects like that in the city of New Orleans as well.
And now I know this was discussed yesterday when we did the tour, and I guess it's really something that comes up whenever you talk about emergencies. It brings out the very best in people and unfortunately brings out the very worst in people. So I know that we had briefly touched on it yesterday while we were in our tour, but I think it's important because when you see a number like $2.5 billion, and perhaps Mrs. Granger can comment on this, but I know that a lot of your work has been with government. But in addition to the obvious, when we talk about this $2.5 billion, we talk about investing in infrastructure, we talk about raising homes and businesses, we talk about making our communities more resilient. What also has been done in order to protect communities and residents from the fraud that we've seen with contractors and especially targeting seniors and people who are in the communities that, we see it. I know where I live on Long Island, we still have homes that are in the air, not put back on their foundation yet because they had a contractor that came in and completely took them for their money, and you never seen them again. And I know that the prosecutors in the area have worked with Consumer Affairs in order to prosecute these individuals, but there's also been laws changed, local laws changed in order to tighten up the ship, and maybe you can comment on the work that's been done, because we don't want to see another $2.5 billion be used and people being taken advantage of again.
Certainly. So at a community-based project, there's very little risk there in terms of the procurement guideline, the process that has to go through, all of that gets sorted out. I think the existing challenge is when an individual family receives a grant to raise their house, to rebuild their house,
right,
and they're not familiar with construction. This may be the first construction project that they have had to go through. So for the state of Louisiana, there's really two things that I would highlight. One is in all of our reconstruction programs, using like HUD CDBG dollars, there's a program by which the state can handle all of that administrative burden, finding the contractor, doing the contracting, and the homeowner is just supporting that work. And then the second piece is in our mitigation programs, everything is milestone based. And that first milestone, that in fact the project can't even kick off until the contract's been put forward, the contractor shows what they're going to do, they've been vetted. So all of that money is really based upon actual performance, and requiring that has been a significant step forward.
Right, so they don't move forward unless they meet the benchmarks.
That's correct.
Okay. Ms. Granger, did you want to comment on that?
Quickly, I did flood as well, and I had flood insurance, and I can tell you, you should put I was not required, I'm in Zone X, but the money went to Wells Fargo, who has my bank, my home loan. They were extremely strict, to the point they didn't want to take my license for me to be able to redo it. So lots of if they were given grants and it was administered the way Wells Fargo administered me working on my house with my flood insurance money, would be really, because there was no way somebody was going to be able to do it without having all of the credentials. It took several layers for them to understand I had the credentials. We designed the plans contractors put together. But I think that there are things that could be in place. While it is great for the homeowner to get the money, like he said, a lot of them don't know what to do. So I think obviously if it was given, whether it's given, if they still have a loan, if the flood insurance has to go back to the mortgage company, maybe the grants should too, because the mortgage companies send inspectors out there, and the mortgage company, while it is I didn't like having to necessarily go through it, but there were several layers, and you did have to have an actual license because it's their risk, it's their home.
Right. And to that point, I think that's what's important. I think that learning from mistakes, not just here in Louisiana, but back on Long Island and in New York, I think the licensing of these contractors and the oversight of them is super important. And when we're investing billions of dollars, there should be an investment in the oversight of these contractors as well, so that the $2.5 billion is actually spent correctly, so that we're not unfortunately giving it to some contractor who's disappearing. And like we talked about yesterday, the government is not in the business of just replacing another loan because you got had by a really bad contractor. So I appreciate it. My time has expired. Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Granger. That's a real issue, making sure that small businesses get what they need and that they're not strangled waiting for payment. You've got listening ears here, you've got listening ears here. Tell us how we can use the resources of Congress to make that easier, to demonstrate that we're going to use our influence to make sure that small businesses are paid timely, because waiting 30, 60, 90, 120 days and beyond is not sustainable for a small business owner. Having a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 approach where someone gets a contract in the matter of natural disasters, the prime gets a contract here, they siphon off all the profit. By the time it gets down to the person that actually does the work, there's very little profit there, if any. Share with me your view on how we can do better. Casey, if you can chime in, and then we'll move down the line, because this is an issue that I think each of you can use your silver bullet, if you will, let's figure out how we can do better by that. Small businesses can't afford to be strangled. Making sure that we provide resources for them that they can access and maintain their businesses and not be offered at the last minute, literally pennies on the dollar, for work that they've already completed.
Thank you. I think there are, in other agencies and other programs, some of those types of things you're talking about are already there. So I think Congress and the federal government has done that. For example, in the CDBG program, we do plenty of grant work in the CDBG program, and we get paid very quickly, as do the contractors. And when the community gets paid, they have to pay, I think, within 7 days. So that's one of the programs that we know on the state and the federal level has worked very well with regards to payment. There's a process, they have it down pat. Never been a problem in collecting from that particular program. I know when you do certain types of projects for the Corps of Engineers, they have requirements to pay within a certain amount. And if it's a small business, especially if you have a small business sub, so if you were working for one of those large firms, you have to be paid within a certain amount of time. So I think that things need to be written in disaster funding. So when disaster funding comes out and the bill comes out, a lot of times there are things that are either added to it or not. So I believe that that could be put in as to here's some requirements, but requirements, and they would have to, from a state level, what requirements they need with regards to what they're responsible for. But I do believe that it could be written in that if it's a small business, and that we're always saying, and federal procurement policy always says, use a small business, you get more points, different things, but then they don't necessarily always safeguard. So people might
They oftentimes use a small business to get a contract, and then these are stories that we hear regularly.
That's correct.
That a small business, a minority, a disadvantaged business, a woman-owned business, an African-American-owned business is used to get the contract, to get those scores, but then when it's time to use them, either they don't use them or they underutilize them, and therefore they've gotten the benefit, but then they've thrown the resource away. So the person who's the business owner still got the shaft.
Correct. We deal with that all the time where folks will ask us, and we have been on contracts where a large firm was selected and we got no work. I have no idea how they reported and how they were able to get funded, but they did get contracts and we were not part of any of them.
Thank you. Casey.
Thank you, Ranking Member Carter. A couple of points. One, both public assistance and hazard mitigation funding are premised on the model that they are reimbursement programs. And the assumption being made there is that the local entity who's executing the project is going to be the one that is paying the bill and then getting reimbursed for what they've paid through the grant program. The reality is that's not practically how it works, and it's in most cases not feasible for a surge of recovery funds to come to a local government and that their budget is going to be able to cash flow those things and execute a reimbursement program. And so I think the fundamental premise needs to be revisited, that a reimbursement-based program, while on an annual grant process may work because you've got the ability to sort of budget and plan for those dollars, it doesn't work in a disaster response or recovery context because your budget is not foreseeing that surge in funding that in some cases may exceed your annual budget by just the funds that come from one disaster event. That's the first point. The second point on the contracting piece, I would think 2 CFR here is limiting in terms of the flexibility to be able to make some of those local decisions about procurement. What we have done in response to that, for example, to your point, when we executed our Ida sheltering program, instead of having one prime company do all of the haul-in installs, we issued probably 8 contracts so that we could ensure that there was local participation, there was small business participation, and we gave multiple firms a chance to perform and then make assignments based upon that performance. And so I think breaking those large contracts into smaller contracts, making them more responsive.
And that helped. That helped a lot. But I'll tell you what still needs to be a little further tweaking. So I want to compliment you on that. But now we've got to make sure that that tier system of tier 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, that person at the bottom who ends up doing the real work gets paid the smallest amount. The people at the top tier take their money off the top and then they sub it out. And the person that's a local vendor, the person that's a DBE vendor, the person that is the actual expert in the subject matter, they're left with nothing in most cases. We've got to dive deeper into how we can fix that tier system. And I think breaking it into 8 was a good start, but now we've got to break a little bit further. And I know I'm far exceeding my time. Please finish your thought.
Just, I would agree with you. I think it's more work on the state. In this case, it certainly was, but it was worthwhile work. The less subcontracting that goes on and the more direct contracts you have to execute that work, I think is a helpful step.
And as I relinquish my time, one other comment I'm going to make, then I'm going to shut up, is that we have to make sure that we have emphasis on using local vendors in the area where we've had the disaster. The last thing, the insult to injury to local contractors is to watch people from other parishes, states, and communities come in to rebuild communities after a storm when, in fact, people that live in those communities have the requisite skills to do it themselves. Why not have people that live in that community rebuild that community and also rebuild the economy? I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I now recognize Mr. Thompson.
Well, the easy answer to the contracting is if the person who's doing the contracting is paid the same money for doing one contract as he would do or she would do for 8, they'll do one and watch TV and drink coffee the rest of the day. But if you say you have to do these contracts in order to perform, that's different. And I think that's part of, I think what we're gonna have to talk about as a committee is how do we do that. The other thing about the tiering, after Tier 2, FEMA doesn't get involved in a subcommittee, in a subcontractors debate. So the low person on the totem pole who's doing the work, who's getting messed over, doesn't really have anybody to complain to because there's no authority. So I think we have to fix some of that because we see it all the time when a large contractor comes in, do one sub, that sub has standing, but the next person is out of luck. So I just think, has that been your experience, Mr. Robinson?
Yeah, certainly. I think that tiered approach, like I said, the sub is the responsible contractor, what goes on below that. And I think as we have this discussion today, I think something certainly we look at in our procurement training is how do we talk about language and request for proposals that kind of keep that from happening. And so certainly something we'll take back and look at from our training perspective on how to advise on a request for a proposal.
Yeah, the other public policy question is in vulnerable communities, primarily low income, African American or whatever, there are very few building codes. And so when you have a disaster and, you know, here comes FEMA to the rescue, and then you get to Rolling Fork, Mississippi, and they don't have building codes. And then you say, well, we can't help you because you don't have building codes. And so we spend months trying to get that in place. But to that local person, you know, you need help right then. So it's been a challenge, and I'm not certain what the answer is other than continue to try to educate the communities that if danger comes or disaster comes, in order for help to be on time and responsive, you have to have this. But then you have to have a system in place that manages it. You can't just have it on the books like we found in other areas, but that's been a major frustration, especially with rural folk. The majority of my district is rural, and people just don't want you to tell them what to do with their own land. You know, I raised chickens on it. My granddaddy did. So that's been a real challenge, but I think the federal, state, local response, back to one of the other comments, it has to be coordinated. The minute an impacted community gets a different response from one of those entities, then it runs off the rails after that. And so I would stress making sure that the coordination of effort is consistent in any disaster we do, because those vulnerable communities are the ones that risk the most because they don't have working knowledge of how. And the Katrina experience here is the gold standard for what not to do. And I encourage all the parties here to remember all those horror stories we heard and saw. And I would hope that at this point, over this period of time, a lot of those issues have been resolved so that, God forbid, if it happens again, it won't be to the level of what we had. But, Mr. Chairman, I just thank you and Mr. Carter for having the hearing, and it's an expensive proposition. I have a number of communities. This is their second disaster, and you go tell that family, FEMA can't fix your house the second time because we fixed it the first time. Then, you know, but they don't have insurance. I mean, it's the challenges that a lot of communities we care a lot about are having. It's quite a challenge, to say the least. So I thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And thank you again to our witnesses. I also want to give a sincere thanks to Southern University for hosting us, as well as the Homeland Security staff for putting this hearing together. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask that the witnesses respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Again, thank you all very much. We appreciate your work. Stay safe. Have a blessed holiday season. Without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.